Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston, and if this is your first time around this channel, this is a place where we do both gear demos as well as studio and production tips and tricks from the perspective of a guitar player working out of a home studio. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that you would be interested in, I would love it if you'd hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. Today we're talking about the Chase Bliss Onward. So I think that Chase Bliss is in something of a sequels era right now. And that's not a critique. I don't think that there's anything wrong with revisiting ideas and updating them. And honestly, it's not even that new for Chase Bliss. You look at the red knob Tonal Recall, the blue knob Spectre, the warped vinyl Marks 1, 2, and Hi-Fi. Chase Bliss has always been a company that has been really good at getting an idea down and then iterating on it and improving upon it once they've kind of lived with it in the world for a little bit. And they've moved out of just that kind of iterating their own things workflow. You look at something like the Goodhertz collaboration, wherein they took the Lossy plugin and reformatted it for a guitar pedal, or more specifically and more relevant to what we're talking about today, something like the Generation Loss Mark II being the third iteration of the Gen Loss concept from Tom Majeski at CooperFX. And I bring that one up because the Generation Loss Mark II is, I think, the best version of the Generation Loss, but I'm a bigger fan of it from the perspective of the classic mode on top, wherein I have all of the original things I loved about the Gen Loss, but in stereo. And this feels like an even bigger swing than that was. This is Onward, a reimagining of the CooperFX Outward pedal from what must be like 5 years ago now, it feels like. But this is no base level reimagining of the original Outward. This is taking a kind of key thing that Tom and the rest of the team at Chase Bliss really liked about Outward and kind of like dialing down and really hammering down on that one idea and then building out a new ecosystem of sound design elements around it. At its core, what Onward is what they would call a dynamic sampler. And what that essentially means is this thing is listening to your playing and grabbing onto new audio as it comes in, reactive to your playing, and then mangling it and reprocessing it in a couple different ways. On one side you have freeze, and on the other you have glitch. On the freeze side, you are basically grabbing audio, the pedal is grabbing audio of your playing and stretching the last little bit of it out into kind of frozen granular pad style sounds. And on the other side, you have glitch, which is going to grab your playing and basically play it back in a kind of micro looper style that can be very quickly chopped up into something a lot more grain focused. There are ways to immediately grab that audio and do cool stuff with it just in terms of time. But I think one of the things I love the most about Onward as a device is a lot of granular pedals, a lot of dynamic samplers, or kind of grain-based pedals in general, I often find lack character, lack focus, lack a sense of identity outside of just we took your audio and we froze it or we stretched it or we chopped it up. I tend to find those things to be a little bit sterile and a little bit uninspiring. And what I like about Onward is you have this kind of act of grabbing the audio. You have your sensitivity, you have the size of the grains you're grabbing, you have how long it sustains for, and you have the waveform in which it kind of onsets and releases the audio captured in the two different samplers in this device. But once that audio is in there, you have a variety of tools to change the character of that audio to make it more inspiring and less just a Xerox of your playing, but put through a paper shredder. And the ways in which you can kind of color and mangle the audio further are the inclusion of an octave control that will kind of sweep in parallel octave up or down with the playing, kind of playing back in the device. And it's not just pitch shifting, it's actually time shifted as well, which means in that glitch mode, as you bring in that kind of octave up, that version of the loop is playing back at double speed, or in the case of octave down, half speed. Below that, you have an Animate control that will set either a vibrato to your wet channel that will kind of have a fixed depth but a variable rate based on the size control, or on the other side you have a very dreamy, wide sounding fixed slow chorus, which I am personally a really big fan of. And once you've captured that audio, once you have kind of used those controls as well as some submenu controls to do things like further EQ the sound in the pedal, you then can move into error, which is going to be the ability to change parameters on the fly in random ways using this error knob, where you can basically change the distortion, breakdown, signal degradation of the audio in the looper. You can change the size of the loop being played back, or the speed and direction of your playback in increasingly random and increasingly chaotic ways using that error knob. And there's a way to do it so that they are all kind of bringing those different glitch modes in all at the same time, which is also very cool. So we have two cool things so far about this device. We have the actual kind of dynamic way in which it grabs your audio at the outset. You have this second thing, which is the ability to change and mangle and add color and movement and character and stereo width and everything else to that audio in a way that a lot of granular loopers and envelope-based loopers like this generally don't do. But there is a thing that makes this more special to me, more immediately inspiring to me. And if you were kind of paying attention to that intro track, I think you might know where I'm going with this, which is this thing locks into MIDI clock so incredibly well. You can set your time on this thing, the kind of size of that looper, and that can either be a tap tempo or it can be a very flexible, progressively making the loop smaller. But if you are feeding this thing MIDI clock, whether it's from a drum machine or your DAW, that size control becomes a subdivision control for that glitch side of the pedal, allowing you to do things like stuttery sidechain effects, very kind of broken, skittery guitar parts that never drift out of rhythm and time with the drums that you are playing to. All of these things that make it a more valuable production tool than just a kind of aimless, formless, meedly bleep bloop machine. And when we talk about Chase Bliss's iterative process, this is one of the things that I am the most thrilled by as we have watched them kind of level up over the last couple of years of Mark II versions of pedals, of the kind of exploration of digital devices and stereo devices, is also the ability to take these pretty esoteric styles of effect and make them, for somebody like me, way more practical and useful in my day in and day out music work. Because I am somebody who is in my studio most of the time that I have a guitar in my hands, and I am mostly playing to a click, to a drum pattern, to a song of some kind, and I want those things to lock into place. And when I'm using a device that does this kind of stuff and it doesn't lock into place, I find myself often going, well, this is all well and good, but when is this ever going to make the record? When is this ever going to end up on a final project? Because I don't want to have to go in and time correct and stretch in Pro Tools. I don't want to have to kind of cut the one in time bit of audio and copy paste it through the rest of the project just to keep it on the grid. I love that Onward stays on the grid so well that it becomes this really rhythmically interesting. And even when you turn that error up, it stays rhythmically interesting and correct in ways that I find really inspiring. So yeah, I think Chase Bliss nailed it with this. I think that Tom from Cooper, who is at Chase Bliss now, has kind of really breathed new life into some of his kind of now on the shelf sounds in a way that both honors what was so cool about the Cooper stuff back when he was doing that stuff, but also brings it into high contrast for a modern production workflow. I'm getting a little bit rambly. I do think that this is a very, very cool device. And so I want to get into the sound samples, and I want to kind of unpack not only what this thing does, but the way in which I think it's useful to look at the workflow of sound in and sound out. So let's get into those sound samples and let's explore Onward. As always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing my Music Man St. Vincent Goldie into the 29 Pedals EUNA, the Cali 76 FET compressor, and the Benson Germanium Boost, all engaged. That's basically just going to set us up with a clean tone. From there, we go into the 1981 Inventions LVL, the Bondi Sick As, and the Strymon Timeline, and then into the front of our amp, which is a Victory Deputy head. From there, we go to the Universal Audio aux box, and then out over digital, our SPDIF output to our DAW, which is Universal Audio's Luna, while also taking the line outputs left and right from the aux and sending them to the input of the Onward. For this reason, we are running things in a wet, dry, wet configuration. The Onward has kill dry enabled and is running on its own stereo send to our DAW in parallel with our dry guitar tone. This is what our dry guitar tone sounds like. So in thinking about how to kind of best explain and walk through Onward, I've elected, instead of going through the kind of conventional all knobs on the face and then all submenu controls afterwards, I actually think it's more helpful and more intuitive, in my mind at least, to kind of break this up into three distinct categories of signal processing that kind of cascade downward from one to the next. So we're going to divide this up into the shape of the pedal, the color of the pedal, and the error component. The shape is basically going to be the way that the glitch and freeze grab incoming audio and kind of replay it and mangle it on a purely kind of like ADSR level. And that is going to be your size, your sensitivity, and your sustain. as well as the fade controls and some submenu stuff as well. We will then get into what I'm calling the color of the pedal, which is going to be the octaves, the texture, the animate controls, and once again, a couple of submenu options as well. And then finally, that error section being your error and your type to kind of like round things out. So the structure of the rest of this video will be explaining glitch and freeze at their core components, running through those 3 phases of the pedal, and then putting it all together in some creative ways at the very end. But before we get into all 3 of those phases, let's start by taking a look at freeze and glitch at their kind of core levels, both kind of how they sound relative to one another, as well as something that I think is really important in understanding them, which is where they kind of pull their audio from at kind of first principles. So let's start by listening to the freeze control. To explain the knob settings we are currently at, size is at its maximum, mix is basically fully up, even though we are on kill drive. This just kind of outputs the pedal at its loudest level. We have no octave, no texture, hence noon and noon. Animate is turned off. Fade is in the most abrupt version, so you can kind of hear things very instantaneously. And we have no error happening right now. This is basically the most uncolored, smoothest, kind of easy to grapple with version of Onward. And then here is freeze, which is going to create a pad-like, almost like synthetic string ensemble next to the Onward, or next to your drag guitar tone. And as you can hear in all of that, it's a very smooth, you can hear a little bit of like glitchy, stuttery things. But the interesting thing about that is Onward reacts very, very obviously to your playing dynamics in terms of grabbing new audio to resample within the pedal. But it also will change the character in which it resamples based on your playing dynamics. So like more choppy, aggressive playing will result in more kind of blips and stutters in both engines, whereas smoother, gentler, more legato playing, finger picking, volume swells, that kind of thing, will give you a more smooth and airy quality. So that is the freeze side. Let's take a look at our glitch side. As you can hear, it is grabbing samples of your input playing, of the kind of like audio sending into the pedal, and then resampling it in chunks at its maximum. It's about 1 second unless you flip to the halftime switch on top, and that will get progressively more choppy as you take that. And of course, these 2 engines work in parallel with one another, allowing you to kind of grab both at the same time or separately. And both can be frozen in place if you like what you hear by pressing and holding. And so now that glitch will stay static. It will not accept any new input on that channel, but we can resample our freeze. or vice versa. You can hand those back and forth. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the way that these can operate in tandem or separately from one another. One more thing that I think it's worth paying attention to here is freeze will sample from the end of your playing dynamics, whereas glitch will grab that last second of audio that you've played, and then as you reduce the size, it will trim towards the beginning of the currently sampled audio. So freeze will always grab the end of the playing and use that as its kind of bed sample, and glitch will take the whole thing but will trim towards the start, which can create some really interesting things. So for example, let's go ahead and turn both on, and this will also kind of serve as our beginning of walking through some of these pedals. And I'm going to play two distinct notes to make a power chord, basically a note and then the fifth above it. So you can hear freeze has grabbed the second note, the fifth above. Then glitch has grabbed both notes. But if you take that size down, it will trim just to the root note below the fifth, basically allowing you to build that chord using two different things. In that same way, if we resample and just like slide a note up, same thing. Freeze grabs the slide up to the full step above. Size will let you sample down to the step below. An interesting little quirk, and there is a reverse dip switch, not to get ahead of ourselves, but there is a reverse dip switch up top for reversing the direction that the glitch plays in. However, no matter whether you're running forward or backwards, size will always trim to the beginning of your playing, not to the beginning of the direction, not to the beginning of the sample, regardless of direction, basically. So if you do a slide up, even if it's playing back in reverse and it's sliding down in the audio, if you bring that size up, it will still trim to the beginning of the way you played it, not the way it's playing back, if that makes sense. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and start walking through some of the parameters on here, starting with, like I said, the shape of Onward. We are going to use glitch for the majority of this stuff, but we will kind of jump over to freeze wherever we want to kind of like accentuate or further delve into a topic in this process. But glitch will be more useful because glitch has an impact on things, or size has an impact on things like glitch, whereas size doesn't really do anything to freeze, because freeze just grabs the end of your playing and resamples it into a pad. So like I said, we're starting with size here. By default, the glitch will be about 1 second of your playing. And so in the kind of like free-form mode of Onward, size is just going to straight up kind of progressively chop up that signal. Shorter size times will obviously allow the pedal to kind of keep up with you more effectively. Longer ones will obviously feel a little bit more kind of aimlessly following you around. It's a very straightforward bit of control right there, but it's worth noting that there are other ways to use this size control. By default, like I said, it is operating as just a way of trimming the signal progressively further back to the beginning of the sampled audio. However, it can also serve as your subdivision control if you are receiving MIDI clock on the MIDI port on this side of the pedal from either a DAW, like I did for the entirety of that intro track, or from an external drum machine or anything like that, which makes it really, really useful for quantized like subdivisions of the audio that you are sampling into the Onward in ways that stays very rhythmic and on the grid, so that like if you're resampling drums or something, it doesn't feel like you're just like drifting off into timeless nonsense. It actually does an amazing job of staying very rhythmically interesting as you kind of cut that size further and further up into different subdivisions. But there is a third way to set the size control on this pedal outside of receiving MIDI clock and using size as a subdivision, and outside of just freewheeling this knob around. By double pressing both foot switches, you can activate tap tempo mode in this thing, and then the glitch foot switch will become your tap tempo, and the freeze will allow you to exit tap tempo mode. So now we have which is very, very cool and can make for some really cool on-the-fly minus the bear style stuff. And then press freeze to exit, and you can kind of like reformat how you want that to work on the fly like this. And let's bring sustain down so that we can clear the buffer a little bit more quickly, which is a thing you will find yourself doing a lot when freewheeling in this pedal. And so those are all the kind of broad strokes, primary ways of controlling the size of the samples in this device. As we just alluded to, sustain is going to be how long Onward holds on to the audio you are sampling into the device. So at fully clockwise, there is no runaway oscillation in this pedal. It is just an infinite hold until you replace the audio in the buffer. So let's take size down to something somewhat rhythmic and put sustain at maximum. By definition, it is a fixed number of repeats around the around this entire thing. So down here at the bottom, it is a single repeat. And not an amount of time that it plays back for. So if you go up here to like 2 repeats, 2 repeats, there's 3 repeats, but whatever, that's fine. And then you take it to that full length, it will play back the exact same number of times. It will just play the entire sample back those times versus pretty straightforward. And so sustain will just kind of like progressively give you more repeats until you hit that that maximum. But it's worth noting, obviously, the size of the repeats playing back, the size of the sampled audio, plays in conjunction with sustain very heavily in how long the overall amount of time audio plays back is. Because if you're playing back 5 times and it's a very short sample versus this is going to take a lot longer. But of course, in all of these situations, anytime you resample the audio, all those things reset. So you've got so each time you kind of like refill the buffer on this thing, every time you clear and refill the buffer with new audio, it is going to basically reset the number of repeats that you are operating in. Very similar to a delay, obviously. The only difference being this wipes the memory of what's currently in there immediately based on your fade control, which is what we will now step into. So fade control is the kind of like ADSR simplified for the Onward. This thing does not have a proper ADSR with attack, decay, sustain, and release, but rather can be thought of as basically a ganged attack and release control that will function in one of three modes based on fade down here. We have been in the more square wavy version of fade so far. Where each repeat comes in immediately and leaves immediately. On the other side, and before we get over there, that applies to freeze as well. As you can hear, freeze onsets very quickly, and this is a good opportunity to hear sustain in conjunction with freeze as well. So with sustain at maximum, fade on immediate, the kind of like frozen pad sound comes in immediately behind your signal and also transitions immediately from change to change. And if you bring your sustain down, it will also leave a lot more quickly. However, if you go to this left side, you go from an immediate kind of like square wave envelope that opens and closes, that kind of like fills and clears the buffer very, very quickly. And instead, you can move to one that is a much more progressive attack and release that also allows the pedal to kind of cross over the audio a little bit more effectively. So let's go to glitch so that we can hear that with a little bit more clarity. You can hear that fading in. So let's play like a low chord and then something high above it so you can hear that transition happen. So you can hear there's a little bit of overlap between those two things, which is also incredibly helpful for kind of creating very smooth transitions on the pad side of things. And obviously by bringing both in, you can create very, very quickly and without even getting into any of the other controls here, a very interesting and complex combination of rhythmic components and soft, billowy textures. The in and the out points on that fade by default are like a pretty like slow progress, especially when you've got size all the way up and everything, and the sustain nice and cranked and all that stuff. It creates for these moments that really kind of spend their time catching up with you in really kind of beautiful ambient ways. But the beauty of this pedal is you don't have to pick between the immediacy of the kind of square and the slowly, kind of gently following at a mile's pace behind you of those kind of slow attack and release settings. In the middle, you got a little dude picture, and that is the user set in and out points. So the submenu control here, the hidden parameter is press and hold both foot switches, and use sustain to kind of set how fast you want those things to onset. So let's go ahead and use freeze for this. As you can hear, by setting it fairly high, we are getting something much closer to the square wave without it being quite so immediate like this. Instead, you can make something with just a little bit more cushion. Or conversely, you can make something that is not quite so lazy in its following as your kind of like slow onset and offset, but still feels very gentle in its approach. And again, even with all this stuff set, we can go ahead and do something like capture that frozen chord. All sorts of cool stuff. And because we have sustained below maximum right now, those glitches will fade away on their own and not hold until the new buffer kind of like gets filled. But freeze will stay the same because we have it kind of like additionally frozen in place with that green LED. Let's go back to our square wave and take a look at the last couple of kind of submenu and dip switch options for adjusting the shape of Onward. An additional way that you can change the overall shape of Onward is with the balance control. Basically a very simple method of kind of setting how much volume glitch and freeze each offer up. By doing that, you can, in order to do that, you can press and hold both switches and adjust the mix control, kind of weighting towards either side of the pedal. So what we have just done here is gone ahead and kind of like cranked it towards freeze, allowing freeze to be the much more dramatically louder side of things. Pretty straightforward. If you want something that allows like a little bit of that movement, but with a focus on those very Brian Eno slow pads, leaning it towards freeze is your friend. Maybe you want just that little bit of added space, almost like an implied amount of reverb, but you want a much more rhythmic performance. You can go ahead and lean more towards that glitch. A lot of ways to kind of reshape things. Additionally, and we're not going to mess with it right now because it's a fine-tuning kind of game, but underneath size, you have a sensitivity hidden control. Press and hold both switches and use the size control to determine how much volume Onward looks for before clearing and refilling that buffer. I've got mine pretty fine-tuned for the fact that this is post-amp, post-cabinet, taking a line output from my aux, but it will be kind of calibrated from Chase Bliss pretty effectively, especially if you were plugging a guitar straight into it or like, running it into your pedal board. But maybe you're in a position where you want kind of your big chords to grab, and then you want to be able to do like smaller kind of like single note runs above that without having to freeze things. You can create something that is more resistant to change, or something that will like resample based on even string noise if you want that added chaos. The final three pieces in the shape of Onward are in the form of dip switches up along the top of the pedal. We'll endeavor to put a little side image over here in the negative space to show you what those dip switches look like. But you have a halftime, a reverse, and a sidechain or ducking feature for this pedal, which is kind of a submenu control over here under Octave as well. We'll start with halftime, which basically doubles the buffer length for your glitch from 1 second to roughly 2 seconds. So let's go back to our more square wavy version of our envelope. Let's take glitch and let's go ahead and turn on halftime. You're going to get slightly lower fidelity, a little bit more kind of grit in the repeats, but you're also going to get a longer overall sample out of this thing. And we will catch something in the glitch before we do this, because the glitch or the halftime will actually have the speed of anything in the buffer when you do it. So which already just sounds so cool. As you can hear, we're getting just way more information in the buffer. Everything we're doing right now will not be affected by freeze, because freeze just grabs that end of your signal. And even the kind of halftime, full-time thing up top will not pitch shift your freeze. It will only pitch shift glitch. But the nice thing is the halftime dip switch is also ganged to a MIDI CC control. So you could get a external MIDI controller and actually be able to kind of like independently and quickly, as a performance tool, change your buffer from half to full speed, allowing you to do things like that kind of stuff. You could do that on the fly using a MIDI controller, which is quite nice. For the final piece of this puzzle, let's go ahead and take a look at the side chaining and ducking features. So we'll go ahead and start with the ducking feature, which is basically an amplitude envelope determined by your input playing dynamics applied to both channels. And what that effectively means is it reduces the volume of glitch and freeze while your guitar or your other instrument is still providing audio to the pedal, allowing your kind of dry guitar tone to sit on top of everything else that will then come back in and swell up as you kind of like let your playing fade away. So let's go ahead and give that a listen. By flipping on that ducking side chaining or that ducking option up top, we now have. Let's go ahead and turn sustain all the way up. As you can hear, and let's freeze both so you can also hear. Just a really useful tool for making sure that those pads and those glitches are there when you need them, but kind of like stay out of the way of your dry guitar when you don't. And again, an effective performance tool. You could freeze that pad in place and then glitch can follow you around, but with all that chaos, your dry guitar still gets to kind of sit on top of everything else. This is also customizable. Say that feels like too much reduction for you. You can reduce the amount that it actually ducks the audio by. Or make it very dramatic. And finally, let's remove that ducking effect and bring in the side chaining dip switch, which basically, as the name would imply, adjusts the amplitude of the freeze based on the resets to the glitch. So if you kind of set and freeze a pad in place, so we have our freeze going, and then every time I reset the glitch, as you can hear, this is being sidechained by the kind of like the reset point in glitch. What's really cool is if glitch is turned off, size becomes the reset rate for this. That kind of rhythmic ducking thing, which is really cool. Also controlled by the duck depth secondary control right there. And once again, because this size control functions as a subdivision knob when you are applying MIDI clock to it and or tap tempo, you actually can set this kind of like pumping, side chaining, kind of very EDM-y effect to be kind of like clocked into your DAW or whatever else. Same with tab tempo. And the final piece of the shape and of everything is just a nice simple one, and it is the ability to reverse the glitch. Also available as a MIDI CC value. Used in conjunction with half speed for some very, very cool effects. Set to that human mode. And that is the shape of Onward. Okay, now that we understand the kind of shape of Onward, the way that we capture, process, and replay sampled audio inside of the pedal, let's take a look at how to take that sampled audio and imbue it with texture, character, and additional movement, because this is not just about getting audio in and freezing it and chopping it up. It's also about manipulating that audio in other musical and tonally interesting ways. So we have our octaves, we have our texture, we have our animate, and we have a couple of additional submenu controls, as well as some kind of creative routing abilities in here as well. So we're going to go ahead and stay in glitch mode for this portion of the video. Obviously, we'll continue to jump back and forth, but the reason I want to be in glitch for octaves specifically is because the octave control is not just about bending the pitch up. It is in fact just blending an octave above and an octave below versus kind of quantized pitch adjustments. But it's also not being pitch shifted. It's actually a difference in playback speed. So this, as you kind of move up from noon, it blends in a double speed octave up loop. And as you come down from noon, it blends in a half speed octave down, which not only gives you octave up, octave down in freeze as kind of more static, just kind of the pitch is different kind of things, but on the glitch side also offers up some additional rhythmic variance. So let's go ahead and capture in a short little phrase. Let's actually go into half speed for this so that we can fit more playing into that glitch buffer. So we have a short little phrase captured in there now, and we can go ahead and as you can hear, that halftime is not limited to the range of buffer, so we're actually getting a pretty low fidelity. That actually goes twice as long in its playback as the buffer itself, which I guess could be thought of as quarter speed available in this pedal, but only in that octave down. And conversely, on the other side of the pedal, you have your freeze control, which is going to, because it doesn't have a lot of movement to it, it will just kind of bring in those octaves as a method of kind of additional pads. So that is the octave control. On the freeze side, it is just going to basically bring in octave up, octave down. There will be some rhythmic variance because there always will be with that octave, but it's way less evident. On the glitch side, you are bringing in half speed and double speed playback of your sample, giving you both an octave up, an octave down, and also rhythmic variance across the entire spectrum, which is very, very cool. Next up, we have our texture control, which gives you the ability to impart Onward's frozen audio in here with either a digital or an analog styled bit of kind of texture and gain. Moving down from noon, it will reduce the sample rate and create more of a bit crushed effect. And above noon will kind of bring in a warmer, kind of more overdriven style tone. And then below that, you have Animate. On the left side, you have a vibrato that has its speed married to the size control. On the right side, you have a kind of dreamy, slow-moving chorus where the rate and the depth are both fixed. And let's go ahead and use freeze for this. So shortest size is going to also be fastest. You can kind of think of it as like shrinking the waveform of the vibrato. Or once again, that fixed chorus sound, which I really love. Say you're right here and you've got your octave up rolling, you've got your texture for that bit crush thing that you're really feeling, get a little bit of that chorusing, but you want it to be a little less. You don't want that sizzle, that digital sizzle of the bit crush. You actually do have, as the sub hidden menu on the texture, you have an EQ. So press and hold both and then roll this back for darker or roll this forward to carve out lows and to kind of make the signal brighter. And conversely, if you're working in like the overdriven side of things, a little bit more texture like that, and you don't want quite as much of that low-end menace that we're hearing right now, you can carve out some lows and bring back that treble. Back to a nice, flat, responsive. We now have our shape of the sampler and its playback defined. We understand how to manipulate the tone and character and movement within it. So let's now take a look at what makes this thing so unique and magical and offers up so much fascinating movement, which is the error and type controls. And we will also use this as an opportunity to really get into the stereo spread functionality of the pedal. So up until this point, we have been operating Onward in standard stereo in, stereo out, where everything is truly processed left and right channels completely separately. You'll notice as we've been playing that you hear moments where maybe freeze or glitch grabs onto something on the left channel or the right channel, and not on the other one. And these moments where kind of things kind of deviate from center channel as they get caught in this. And the reason for that is because, like I said, this is a true stereo pedal where left and right channels are processing independently by default when you're running it in stereo. And because the signal that we are operating this in front of, the signal that we are kind of feeding into Onward, includes stereo room mics in the amp sim in the cabinet software that we're using. Sometimes one channel will catch something that the other one doesn't, and those things drift off to the sides. But by default, it will kind of process things in center channel because it should be seeing mostly information that is identical on both channels, as you've been able to hear so far, this kind of thing. But if we apply stereo widening, you'll hear it's now playing back more consistently, but with a little bit of like Haas effect stereo widening applied to it. And you won't have those random moments where the normal playback drifts to the sides. Because what's happening now is instead of the left and right channels processing totally independently, they are now summing to mono in the wet signal and then processing through out into stereo. What that means is the analog signal still passes through unencumbered, left channel, right channel, left channel, right channel. Any ping-ponging effects ahead of this will still retain their image, but the audio being used to generate new stuff inside of Onward is being compressed down to a center mono channel and then spread back out and distributed across the stereo field. And the reason we're using that for, let's turn that off. The reason that we are using stereo spread for the error stuff is so that those errors are applied kind of strategically on the left and right. And so with that stereo spread on, let's start to talk about this error section, because that's where the spread really comes into play more dramatically here. So error itself is the likelihood that one of three types of errors will occur in the playback of this pedal. So you have three different types of errors. You have on the leftmost position, it is a size playback error. This means that as you turn this up, it increases the likelihood that the size of the audio playing back will change. It will chop into smaller granules during the kind of playback process. And what's really nice about this is it will still operate in conjunction with that MIDI clock. So in that same way that this size control operates as a subdivision control in a MIDI clock environment, that is also going to be true with the playback size error information. And what that means effectively is if this thing is hooked up to a drum machine or a DAW MIDI clock, when you turn up that error control, those randomly selected smaller chunks of audio that play back will still be quantized to your project, which is incredibly useful for fun, kind of like glitchy moments of extra stutters and almost a kind of like trap rolls kind of thing, but all done in time to your project, even with error turned up. The center position is going to be changes to the sample rate and overall audio quality. So as you turn this up, it will randomly kind of reduce the sample rate on the audio and create gaps in your audio's playback as well. And the third one is going to be changes to the playback speed and direction, which, much like this octave control, is not just going to be changes in the kind of pitch itself and the direction itself, but it's going to be changes in the speed of the audio playing back causing those pitch shifts. So you'll randomly get, double speed playbacks or half speed playbacks going forwards and backwards. And once again, you'll hear a lot of stereo spread stuff as you turn, especially that one up. It becomes very, very magical and interesting. So we're going to start in that rightmost position with speed and playback. We're going to capture something in glitch. Let's actually turn spread back off for the moment so that when it comes in, you hear the real, like, obvious benefit of this sound. So we are in changes to speed and playback. The other benefit to stereo spread is it will process the speed and playback parameters separately on the left and right channels. Right now, it is processing them at the same time for independent left and right. So if we had two different audio sources on the left and the right, they would be processed separately, but they would be receiving the same error messages at the same time. By applying stereo spread, you are now processing error messages left and right separately, but a unified wet signal, if that makes sense. And this can, of course, still be used in conjunction with so sometimes it'll happen, because they're processing left and right separately. Sometimes they will hit at the same time. Sometimes they will process on one side and not the other. And the more you increase that error, the more likely those playback glitches will occur. And again, with no stereo spread, and with it turned on. And let's hear some of that same stuff with our freeze control. Already, by the way, it's worth noting, freeze with that stereo widening applied to it sounds so much more magical right off the bat. Let's bring in some glitch. I told you this is where the magic happens. Okay, we can't live here forever. Let's go ahead and zero out those parameters. And let's reset back down, turn our glitch back on, and let's give that middle position the condition a listen. So once again, this is going to be reductions to the sample rate and kind of moments where the audio just fully fails on us. So you can hear those moments where the bit crushing, the south of noon on texture kind of comes into play, as well as just like missing chunks of audio. One thing that's worth pointing out in both the speed and direction, and in this failure with these kind of gaps dropping out, that will also prove to be true in the size stuff, is everything always feels very quantized to itself. Like I said, you can use MIDI clock to quantize it to other things, but even as a self-contained device, where the gaps happen, where the drops happen, everything feels very intentional in its placement, even when it's random, which is quite nice. Okay, let's give this third type a listen. This is going to be changes to the size of the audio playing back, basically allowing you to have like glitchy, stuttery moments brought into the pedal. Worth noting, as you hear this, error in this mode seems to only trend downward from the size's position. So here at the longest, you can kind of, this will randomly chop down from here, but if you're down here, you're not randomly getting longer snippets from the audio. Again, this is one that's going to have way less of a play on freeze. It's there, but it's less kind of stated because size has such a smaller impact on this side of the pedal. It does change the size of the grains, but like it mostly just creates more of a grinding than it does like a stuttering. I'm not personally a huge fan of that effect. I think it really does shine on glitch, as does the actual size control by definition. You might be thinking to yourself, that's all well and good. In fact, those are all great. Those all sound amazing. Why do I have to pick one? And to that I say the answer is you really don't. There is a hidden parameter for error right now, which is the ability to hold both buttons and increase the error knob in order to blend in the odds of the other two effects being brought in as well. So we are back on the speed and direction. We are going to capture something in our glitch. And now you're getting those random changes to speed and direction. By pressing and holding and turning up error, you will actually increase the odds that it pulls one of the other types of error instead. You'll notice you're hearing more random drops from condition and more of those random stutters like we just heard on the left channel thanks to the size chopping one. If you max out that, it's just going to pull from all three at equal measure. So now you take it back down to the normal playback. And now it doesn't matter which of these you're on, you're going to get just a full mix of all available types of error in the pedal. And again, this can make for some really cool stuff when you are playing and just letting it follow along. So there is an additional bit of kind of like fine-tuning and preference-based changes you can make to Onward, despite everything we've already looked at. And that is the fact that you can take everything we've talked about and decide whether you want it applied to glitch and freeze or just one or the other. As you heard just now, we had our freeze kind of frozen in place and glitch was following our playing around. We can go ahead and decide if we want the kind of movement information, octave, texture, and animate to kind of be applied to both signals. We can decide if we want sustain applied to both signals, and we can decide if we want error applied to both signals, or we can, by holding both foot switches and flipping each of these switches down here, decide if we want error, like just glitch routed to error, just movement routed to our freeze, that kind of thing. So to kind of showcase that, let's go ahead and turn both on. Let's go ahead and capture something in that freeze. And then press and hold both. And now our animate, and our octave, and our texture are only routing to our freeze control. So that chorus is now only on our freeze control, and it is not on the glitch. So if I play and kind of bring in new glitch sounds, you can hear there's no changes happening to the modulation of glitch. Which means I could also bring in that octave down on my freeze and still have my glitch side following me around at my own kind of unity pitch. And then likewise, let's go ahead and, because if I turn up my error right now, you can hear that it's also messing with my freeze. Maybe I want that pad to stay frozen in place. You'll hear we have now completely gotten rid of the error processing on freeze, but it will process through to my glitch. And likewise, even if this wasn't frozen, I could unfreeze this and I could apply the sustain control to just one or the other as well. And if you get completely lost in all of this, with all these submenu controls and routing options, by flipping this bottom preset switch back and forth 3 times, you can actually reset all of your hidden controls, which is quite nice. And a nice gentle fade out. Having gone through everything, let's talk about some use cases for putting all of this stuff together. So there's some really excellent use cases for all of this craziness. For example, if I wanted those kind of failure options there, I could bring in my freeze control. And the beauty here is that'll freeze in place. I can have my glitches drop out like crazy and have it not, like you heard earlier, when we had our dropouts really cranked, it felt really jittery and glitchy where things were failing way too often. This way, glitch will fail a lot, but freeze will be there to offer us some kind of consistency in our audio. And the beauty of that too, one of the really fun consequences of this is that error will give you, the error and the speed and direction will give you access back on glitch to changes in octaves and that texture control, because even though Animate over here is all routing directly down to freeze and bypassing glitch, this system is only applied here, and this is a lot of this stuff but recontextualized. So you actually can just process them with the same types of effects, just separately. Once again, let's just start building on this sound. Let's bring that sidechaining in with the glitch. Make those glitches a little bit more subtle. And let's let freeze follow us around a little bit better. Really, really cool stuff. Yeah, that's Onward.